for democracy, they strive for domination. And that is where so many parallels come between this conflict, as so many others that we have stood against, and the great patriotic war, the great anti-fascist struggle that we are here to commemorate and celebrate the sacrifices that the world, don't forget, this was the sacrifice not just of Russia, but of the Soviet Union, not just of the Soviet Union, but of the united working people who looked towards socialism as being the harbinger of a new world, not dominated by conflict of man versus man, but where we could really build a peaceful, cooperative, and prosperous society based on production and technology that already exists today. And it's with this in mind to talk to us a little bit about the real history of the Second World War, of the great anti-fascist struggle, that I have great pleasure in introducing Harpal Brar, founding chairman of the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist.
Thank you, Comrade Chairperson. Comrades and friends, you'll forgive me for not standing up because nature is taking its toll on me. And it's a pleasure to be here, that we are celebrating the victory of the people of the world, particularly of the people of the Soviet Union and the people of China, who gave so much to make sure that would be freed from Nazism and Japanese fascism. Now, Comrade Chairperson has given you a memorable quotation from George Galloway about how speaking the truth itself becomes revolutionary. You don't have to be revolutionary. You don't have to call yourself a communist. The very fact that you will speak the truth marks you out as the worst enemy of imperialism. This reminds me, and this is really what I want to start my contribution with, of a very well-known, perhaps not so well-known, quotation by Engels. It comes from his unfinished History of Ireland. He says, the bourgeoisie turns everything into a commodity, hence also the writing of history. It is part of its being, of its condition of existence, to falsify all goods. It falsified the writing of history. And the best paid historiography is the one that is best falsified in the interest of the bourgeoisie. Does it strike a bell? If you want to actually become a famous writer and who makes money, or makes a living, and a good living out of writing, then make sure that you falsify whatever you write in the interest of the ruling class. The history of the Second World War, especially since the collapse of the Soviet Union, has been greatly falsified by the bourgeoisie and its extremely well-remunerated flunkies in the media, both electronic and print media. They repeat the same mantra. They constantly talk about the rules-based world order. They talk about human rights, freedom of speech, etc. They don't give a damn about any of these things in real life. And they falsified the history of the Second World War. And I want to give you a small quotation from a leading article in the Sunday Times on the 50th anniversary of victory against fascism. And having done a long rigmarole about who fought whom, the Sunday Times goes on to say, let us not forget that the red, white, and blue Union flag we fly this weekend flew alone in the face of the all-conquering Nazi tyranny before the tide turned in 1942. We were fighting for our freedom and to free Europe from despotic rule. That's what the Sunday Times says. Just to put things slightly right, like NATO, my speech will be entirely defensive. And if some of the observations I make annoy some of you, I apologize in advance. Well, what was exactly this war? First of all, you can hardly expect imperialist countries to say that the World War I as well as the Second World War were products of imperialism. They arose from the existence of the imperialist states, where uneven development of capitalism makes periodical redivisions of the world almost a necessity. Those that at one time, at the time of the last division, lagged behind but have spurted ahead in their development, they say this system is not fair. We're not getting our fair share. They've got more slaves, although they're industrially weaker than us. We want our fair share, and that's where it starts. The difference between the First and Second World War was this, that by the time the Second World War took place, a new power and a new element had come in world politics. That is, the First World War, which had been fought for redivision of the colonies, markets, avenues of investment, and the rest of that goes with it, was a disaster for imperialism because it ushered in the great Soviet Union. It brought into existence the first state of the proletariat, if you ignore the Paris Commune, which lasted very, very briefly indeed, and had important lessons to teach, which are drawn by Marx in the Civil War in France. It's a pamphlet you must read. It was a disaster for imperialism. So they had started the war to redivide the world. But what they ended up was the Bolshevik Revolution. And the Bolshevik Revolution became a determining factor in world politics after that. Even today, many decades after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Bolshevik Revolution continues to dictate world politics. If the very backward people with very backward ideology, like the Afghan Taliban, have won in Afghanistan, it is in no small degree to the forces of liberation unleashed by the Bolshevik Revolution. What was the Soviet position in regard to war? Yes, war is a product of imperialism. Yes, war was coming. But it was the position of the Soviet Union. She did not want to be involved in any war with imperialism. They wanted peace. They wanted peace to develop their economy. And they were doing fantastically well when the imperialist world was in the grip of a deep economic crisis that started at the end of 28, beginning of 1929, and was not to disappear until many years after the Second World War. They didn't want any war. But of course, it wasn't up to the Soviet Union alone to make sure that there would be no war. So if the war came about, Soviet Union did not want to be fighting on its own. Left alone against the combined forces of all the imperialist countries, fascist as well as non-fascist, fascist as well as what was those days described as the democratic imperialist powers. Fascism is not something that drops from the sky. It's a product of imperialism. It's the imperialist bourgeoisie in given countries who are in deep crisis, facing a revolutionary movement, see no alternative to actually instituting the naked terroristic dictatorship of the ruling class. That's what fascism is. Fascism is not German. It is fascism of the imperialist bourgeoisie in a given country in deep crisis. If there was no fascism of the German type in Britain or United States, it is because the position of the ruling class in these two countries was never threatened to the extent it was in Germany or Italy or anywhere else. That's the reason for it. To actually say that to be a fascist, you've got to have a Hitler mustache, right? To actually be a fascist, that you cannot be one of the things that recently been prosecuted, how can Ukraine be fascist? It's got a Jewish president. Well, first of all, people's religion has absolutely no value to me. He could be Muslim, he could be Christian, he could be Jewish. What you judge a person by, or a government by, or a ruling class by, is the policy that it is pursuing. And on that basis, an Indian could never be a fascist. I put it to you, an Indian can be a fascist. I know some of them personally. Likewise, a Jew can also be a fascist. You only have to look at the Zionists, what they do, to know that Zionism. It is to the shame of humanity and to the shame of the Jewish people that actually there is a Zionist movement which speaks in their name but actually acts as the military wing of imperialism in the Middle East and acts in a totally fascistic way towards Palestinian people. So the Soviet Union didn't want to fight on its own. To that extent, it actually sought to make an alliance with what the Soviet Union those days described as democratic imperialist powers. Now you may think it's a contradiction in terms. It's only a contradiction if you don't look at the real division between the two. The fascist powers were out to redivide the world, and this could only happen at the expense of the so-called democratic imperialist powers. There were real contradictions between the two camps, and Soviet Union sought to exploit it. To that extent, it sought collective security arrangements with the democratic imperialist powers. It tried for years to have an alliance with them to actually prevent Germany from committing aggression. Imperialist powers would not pay ball. And in fact, they went on. Britain, France, entered into the Munich Pact, where there were 4 powers present: Britain, France, Italy, and Germany. Soviet Union wasn't even informed that this meeting was taking place. Suddenly you have Neville Chamberlain come back and waves a piece of paper and says, "Peace in our time." Now history is being rewritten, as Engels had said. It's being falsified in the interest of the bourgeoisie. When Chamberlain came to the House of Commons with that piece of paper, "Peace in our time," there was a standing ovation for several minutes, which was completely unanimous. There was nobody who dissented from Chamberlain at the time. Of course, later on, he's been decried. Chamberlain was an appeaser. What is this appeasement? It's a wrong description. It's not an appeasement. It was a little price paid by European imperialism to Hitler. You can have a few districts of Czechoslovakia, but please march your armies in the direction of Soviet Union. That is the real enemy. Fight against Bolsheviks. They are real enemies of yours as well as ours. Hitler had written in Mein Kampf, My Struggle, which is his autobiography, that Germany would look in future for its wars, not in the West, but in an easterly direction. They had vowed to actually eliminate Bolshevism. And the British bourgeoisie was very complicit in it. In the rise of fascism, the American, British, and the French bourgeoisie were very complicit. First of all, in 1935, that is 4 years after the Nazis had come to power, Britain entered into a naval treaty with Germany, which allowed Germany to rebuild its naval forces because there were constraints put on it by the Versailles Treaty after the First World War. Then American dollars flooded Germany to build Germany's industrial base. When in 1935, German forces reoccupied Ruhr, which they were not allowed under the Versailles Treaty, neither France nor Britain raised a finger. And they were powerful enough to actually eject the German army from Ruhr Valley if they wanted to. That is what they did. In 1937, the foreign minister of Britain, at that time was Lord Halifax, I think, believes still, he went to Hitler and said, "We are very pleased that you've destroyed communism in your country. And we look to the service of Germany in preventing the spread of communism westwards. And Germany is entitled for her services to be rewarded." That is what was taking place in 1937. And what Chamberlain was carrying on was a continuation of that policy. And you must never forget, war is not a question, as has already been pointed out, some speakers, our chairman has pointed out, who attacked whom first. That's not the important point. Who fired the first shot is irrelevant. The question is, war is a continuation of policy, and what was the policy of British imperialism at that particular time? If British imperialism was fighting on its own, it was actually paying for the sins that it had committed in trying to encourage Nazism in the direction of invading the Soviet Union. It had refused to enter into a collective security agreement. When they signed the Munich Agreement, even then for months, remember it was signed 11 whole months before the Soviet-German Non-Aggression Pact was signed in the month of August 1939. Soviet Union still continued with it. Britain, which had, at the nod of Hitler, sent ministers to go and meet Hitler, had sent its prime minister to go in and pay obeisance to Hitler. When they wanted to negotiate with the Soviet Union, they sent a retired third-class general with a 4-barreled name. I can't remember. There are so many barrels in his name, so many hyphens in that. And what is more, when he reached the Soviet Union, he disclosed that he had no plenipotentiary powers to enter into a binding agreement. The Soviet Union realized this is not possible to enter into an agreement. Stalin had already given a warning in his 18th Party Congress speech, which was at the beginning of 1939, March 39. He said, there are people who are trying to get Germany and Soviet Union to fight against each other. These people may find themselves that history will write the chapter completely different from their wishes. And then they should not come to us, because they're used to having other people pull chestnuts out of fire for them, just as the imperialists are doing with the Ukrainians. They want to fight in Ukraine to the last drop of the last Ukrainian to conduct NATO's war against Russia. So having tried its best to enter into a collective security agreement with the so-called democratic imperialist powers, the Soviet Union in the end was obliged to turn in a different direction to protect her own interests. So she signed in August, toward the end of August 1939, the Soviet-German Non-Aggression Pact. It's been portrayed as an alliance between Germany and the Soviet Union. It wasn't an alliance. It was that we won't invade you and you won't invade us. The Soviet Union had no desire to invade anybody. She didn't want a war with anybody. So it was perfectly all right for Soviet Union. And the agreement she was signing, the Non-Aggression Pact, had been signed by more than half a dozen countries with Germany already. So what is Soviet Union being accused of? From Trotskyites, counter-revolutionaries, to the bourgeoisie and the petty bourgeoisie, all say Stalin signing the Non-Aggression Pact brought the war nearer. No, it didn't bring the war nearer. It only meant that the war started between different countries from the one that Western imperialist countries had hoped it would start with. In doing so, the Soviet Union turned the tables on the so-called appeasers i.e. people who wanted to incite Germany to fight against the Soviet Union, with the double purpose of weakening a rival imperialist power, namely Germany, and secondly, destroying Soviet communism, which was the purpose of their policy. Tables were turned, and it gave the Soviet Union close to 2 years of further preparation to strengthen her defenses against a war that she knew was coming. If there's a mistake made by the Soviet Union, and it's not really a mistake, it has just so happened historically, that when Soviet Union had expected the war on the continent to last another 2 years, because France was supposed to be a great military power with its Maginot Line, which could not easily be penetrated. When the Germans attacked France, it collapsed within 5 weeks. This great imperialist power with large colonies, with a long history of waging war against everybody, collapsed in 5 weeks. And part of the reason it collapsed was that it had Nazi collaborators within the ruling class. When Hitler established his puppet government headed by General Pétain, and in the National Assembly, the overwhelming majority voted for the establishment of that puppet government in Vichy. And to the shame of people who call themselves Social Democrats, majority of the Social Democratic deputies in that assembly voted for the Pétain government. So when we call the Social Democrats social fascists, people accuse us of splitting the working class movement. No, comrades, we're not splitting the working class movement. These are the murderers of revolutionaries such as Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. These are the people who drowned the German Revolution in the aftermath of the First World War in blood. These are the people who actually wanted to be a loyal opposition to Hitler, didn't want to fight against it, didn't want to collaborate with the communists even after the Hitlerites had come to power. But the Hitlerites paid no respect to them. They said, you may profess loyalty to Herr Hitler, but you belong in the jail. They were thrown in the dungeons all the same. And even during the war, the Social Democrats in Germany continued to say that it would be a disaster. It would be a disaster if either Germany or the Soviet Union won the war. The war had to be won by Anglo-American democracy. That was their position. That was the position of the Social Democrats. And on that, I'm afraid, was the position of Churchill as well. Churchill has been portrayed as a great fighter against fascism. Churchill went in the 20s to Italy, spoke in the Scala Theatre in the presence of Mussolini, and addressing Mussolini said, "Sir, or Your Excellency," I don't know the words he used, "if I was in your country, I would have voted for you." That's Churchill. Churchill's long-time ambition was visceral desire to actually scuttle and slaughter and to drown in blood the Russian Revolution and the Soviet Union. Very, very belatedly he realized that the game was up and it wasn't working. So when he turned against the so-called appeasers, it was because he was a loyal empire person. He did not want this greatest of empires to be lost to the Germans. And he therefore turned against Germany and wanted to fight against Germany. But that was to defend its colonies and its empire and its avenues for investment. It was not the fight against fascism. After the Battle of Moscow, when it became clear that the Soviet Union was a hard nut to crack, and on the eve of the Battle of Stalingrad, Churchill wrote a secret memorandum to his cabinet in which he said, it would be a total disaster if Russian barbarism was to prevail over the ancient civilization and states of Western Europe. That is on the eve of the Battle of Stalingrad, where the Soviet Union was fighting for its life and death if you like. Every imperialist, because they believed their own propaganda, believed that the Soviet Union would not survive 6 weeks. It could not survive against the mightiest military machine the world had seen up to then, namely the German war machine. Well, 6 weeks became 6 months. 6 became 4 years. And the Soviet Union drove the Nazis out of Soviet territory. And after the Battle of Moscow, a German soldier had written graffiti on the walls of a village just 30 kilometers from Moscow, "I'm off to Berlin." And a Soviet soldier from the Red Army comes a few days later and puts a rejoinder, "See you in Berlin." And they kept that promise. They went to Berlin, and as George has mentioned, the most iconic picture of the end of the Second World War are the two Soviet soldiers, one at the plinth and the other one on top of the Reichstag building, flying, installing the red flag over the Reichstag. Soviet Union lost 27 million people, 10 million who were in the army. 3 million of them were the best elements in the Soviet Union, i.e. the members of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And Soviet people behind the front lines, and they were actually supplying the Soviet army with everything. The Soviet people, notwithstanding a few scum like the Banderaites, fought as united against the forces of aggression, forces that were trying to destroy the first working class state, the motherland of the international proletariat. You're probably fed up listening to me. I'll try to wind up as quickly as I can. Now, the question is the Soviet Union, if against all odds, against all the predictions, from Trotsky to the imperialist bourgeoisie to the Germans themselves, if the Soviet Union won, what were exactly the reasons? Very briefly, first of all, the Soviet Union had eliminated the fifth column through the purges, the Moscow trials, and the trial of about a dozen military top generals. Every Trotskyite, every bourgeois ideologue propagates the lie that the Soviet Union had been weakened by these Moscow trials. Stalin dealt with that question in the 18th Party Congress. He said, are these journalists, and I think it's probably he was being unfair to the Ethiopians. They know nothing about politics. They know nothing about the economy of nations any more than the emperor of Abyssinia knows about higher mathematics. Now, I do not know what the knowledge of the emperor of Ethiopia or Abyssinia was about higher mathematics. But the point is made clear. They know nothing. He said, they're talking drivel. Are we told that if spies, assassins, saboteurs, and murderers were let loose and left open, the Soviet Union would be more strong? No. The Soviet Union was very strong because it had eliminated the fifth column. There were no quislings waiting to greet Hitler in the Soviet Union. The second reason for the victory of the Soviet Union was socialism. The Soviet Union had built its might through collectivization and through industrialization. Every bourgeois will tell you that Soviet agriculture was destroyed. But there are some honest bourgeois scholars, even if their credentials were that of a Trotskyite nature, like Isaac Deutscher. You should read his biography of Stalin. He never misses an opportunity of saying what a dreadful dictator he was. But when you finish reading, Stalin comes out larger than life. And I like his biography precisely because he's a Trotskyist, he's anti-Stalin, but besides his affiliation, in spite of his affiliations, he nevertheless is able to portray Stalin as he was, a truly giant figure of world politics. And the Soviet Union, through its industrialization and collectivization, was able to build its strength. There were people, and this industrialization had to be done not only in the teeth of opposition from imperialist bourgeoisie, but also in the teeth of opposition within the Soviet Union, in the Bolshevik Party, the Bukharinites and Trotskyites. At the time, there were people in the Soviet Union who were saying the tempo of industrialization must be slowed because it's taking a heavy toll on the Soviet people. Stalin, speaking to a conference of business executives of Soviet industry in 1931, said, "Comrades, far from being slowed, the tempo must be increased. Those who lose the tempo get beaten. We do not want to be beaten." He said, the story of old Russia was she was always beaten by the Mongol Khans, by the Turkish base, by the Lithuanian and Polish gentry, and by the European capitalists. She was beaten for her backwardness. It was easy to beat her, and because she was rich in resources, it was good for plunder. We can beat her. That was the story. But we have got a motherland now, motherland of the working class. We do not want to be beaten. And he then went to say, these are prophetic words. We are 50 or 100 years behind advanced countries. We either make that difference within 10 years or they crush us. And almost exactly to the day from that speech, the Soviet Union was invaded. And everybody admits, from Deutscher to Ian Gray to everybody who looks at history objectively, that had it not been for collectivization and industrialization, there's no way the Soviet Union could have emerged from that war victorious. Deutscher says collectivization, with its hundreds of thousands of tractors, with its machine and tractor stations, with its machinery, had taught the peasants to handle modern machinery which they had never known. During the First World War, the Russian peasantry which was in the army was extremely backward. They were so badly supplied that sometimes 3 soldiers had to share 1 gun. Can you imagine going to a battlefield and you say, "Can you lend me your gun for the next 5 minutes?" I mean, what an army you made. But that was not the case in the Soviet Union. A lot of effort was made to prepare the Soviet Union for that particular war. And Deutscher says that collectivization with its mechanization of agriculture was a preparatory school for the Russian masses to handle modern machinery, from tanks to aircraft to everything. And notwithstanding the fact that the Nazis wreaked such devastation, the Soviet collective farms and the Soviet industry were able to keep supplying the Red Army during those 4 horrendous years of the crucible that the Soviet army was going through. The next reason for Soviet victory was the USSR. It was a unique community, the like of which the world has never seen before and has not seen once. Dozens of nationalities, dozens of religions, people of different, were united in one single Soviet Union. And they fought together, whatever the slanders against the Soviet Union and the Soviet Communist Party. The fact of the matter is that the Soviet soldiers in their millions went to their deaths with the slogan, "For the motherland and for Comrade Stalin." If Stalin was such a tyrant, if he was so much hated, surely war is the best time to get rid of them. War is something that tests a country to its very limits. And the Soviet Union emerged from that war victorious because they were united as one family. whether you were Muslim, Christian, Jewish, or anybody. Whether you were a Kazakh, Tajik, Turkmen, Georgian, Russian, Belarusian, you fought as one person. You only have to read a moving letter written by somebody young who died in that war, the son of Dolores Ibarruri, La Pesenaria. It makes me very passionate to relate it to you. He writes to his mother a letter. He said, I've got a few minutes to write to you, mother. When I left, you said, do not be afraid. And he says, mother, that was an insult. It's a real honor to be fighting in this army, which represents the best of Soviet people. And I will do my best. And my hands will not tremble when I shoot at those Nazi invaders. Another factor was the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union wasn't born yesterday. It was brought into existence by the great Lenin, who had fought for 20 whole years to fight against all kinds of opportunism within his own party and within the international communist movement. At a time when the real communists were actually isolated, he was somebody who stood and organized the Russian communist movement as well as the world communist movement. So it was that tradition which, after Lenin's death, was carried on under the leadership of Stalin, and the Soviet Communist Party actually was a highly respected party. There is no bourgeois party in the world that could command the respect of its people in the way that the Communist Party of the Soviet Union did. The next factor was the ideology of the Soviet Union. At the end of the 17th Party Congress, which was just following the completion of the first five-year plan, when the Soviet Union had achieved spectacular results, Stalin, in his closing remarks, delivering his report on behalf of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, asked the question, comrades, to what do we owe our victories? And he says, the answer is that we fought under the banner of Lenin, so Marx, Engels, and Lenin. And what's the conclusion? We must continue to be faithful to the banner of Marx, Engels, and Lenin. I know you got a note for me. I'm about to finish. Okay. And the very final point is the leadership of Stalin. At least during the war, it was admitted even by the leaders of the leading imperialist powers, America and Britain, that nobody could actually lead the Soviet people the way Joseph Stalin could. It wasn't for nothing from Roosevelt to Churchill called him Uncle Joe. British workers who were sending aid to the Soviet Union producing tanks, they will produce a tank and write on it another one for Uncle Joe. Now I accept the fact that British people fought against Nazism. I have no problem with that the British people fought against Nazism. I wish I could say the same about the British ruling class. I cannot, while being at the same time truthful to history and to what actually happened. As Lenin used to say, the proletariat needs the truth and not plausible lies. And we in my party say unpleasant things. People which go against the common prejudice. The common prejudice is entertained because of the imperialist all-pervading media and because the average idiot does not bother to look into facts. I'm sorry, but that's the truth. I'm not against ordinary people. I'm not saying every ordinary person is an idiot. But the opinion makers among them do not bother to actually find the truth. You find a person, and he says, Stalin was a murderer, tyrant. I said, what do you know about Stalin, sir? And on closer inquiry, you ask a couple of questions, they do nothing. So their general opinion is like that of a bourgeois reviewer of books who said that I never read a book that I review in case it affects my judgment. They do not allow facts to come in the way of their narrative. Facts are inconvenient, but all the same, mother reality is very sobering. In the end, it will dawn upon people what it is. 20 years after the Iraq War, everybody is saying it was the wrong war, it was the unjust war. But we who were saying at that time were portrayed as lunatics. George Galloway has told you, well, I'm not famous, nobody bothers me. If I'm in the street, nobody recognizes me, so nobody bothers to attack me. But if you are, and I'm pleased about that, I don't want to be, I don't particularly wish to be attacked. I mean, my idea of a revolutionary is not somebody who wants to die tomorrow. My idea is to live and kill my enemies. You know, that's what we. Of course, revolution demands sacrifices. A lot of us gets killed, and it's an honor to get killed in that kind of fight. But I cannot go along with people who say, the British bourgeoisie were fighting against fascism, and no sooner as the war is ending, Churchill is planning a war against the Soviet Union, and he's murdered the Greek Revolution. There are Greeks sitting in this meeting. They'll tell you, you don't have to believe my word, they'll tell you the benefits of Churchill's anti-fascism. They actually brought to power in Greece the very people who were fascists, and they murdered those who had fought against fascism in the partisan war. And very finally, at the very beginning of the war, the Soviet Union suffered some reverses. What were the reasons for those reverses? And I'm running through. One was that the Germans had the advantage of surprise attack. They were the first. Now, it's not that the Soviet Union wasn't expecting to fight Germany, but the date of the attack can still be a surprise. Of course, there were Germans coming closer, military coming closer to the Soviet border. And many people wanted the Soviet Union to attack Germany. Soviet Union did not, because there was such a lot of disinformation going on. It had been the endeavor of American, British, and German imperialism. American, French, and British imperialism that Soviet Union and Germany should fight. And Stalin held back from that in case it was a disinformation. It probably wasn't a disinformation, but then everybody can be wiser after the event. But nevertheless, nobody should believe that the German army simply walked into the Soviet Union. In the first 3 months, the Germans lost 700,000 soldiers dead and 300,000 captured. Read General Zhukov's book, The Best of Zhukov's Battles, edited by Harrison E. Salisbury. He'll tell you the whole story. 120 German divisions were knocked out in the first 3 months of the war. And the Soviet Union went on to fight the Battle of Stalingrad. And these battles of Leningrad, Stalingrad, Kursk, Leningrad, and Berlin are an eloquent testimony to the fighting capacity of the Red Army and of the Soviet people. And forever, they shall continue to inspire anti-fascist and anti-imperialist people all around the world, and we shall forever be indebted to them. The second reason was Germans had 2 years of experiencing war. So they were well practiced in waging war. And in the process, they'd gathered not only their own army divisions, but also the people they'd subjugated, or who were their allies, because the ideology of the ruling classes of Romania and Bulgaria, etc., was totally fascistic anyway. So when they took their armies to the Eastern Front, they had not only 176 of their own German divisions, but also of their allies. So there were 240 divisions pitted on the Eastern Front throughout the war against the Soviet Union. That's what the Soviet Union were having to do. And the third reason was the refusal of the Western countries to open the second front. Molotov had come to London at the beginning of 1942, entered into an agreement with Churchill and the representative of Roosevelt, Averell Harriman, in London, that they will open a second front towards the end of 42. And when Averell Harriman and Churchill went to Moscow in 42, both of them went back on that promise and reneged on it. They kept on delaying the second front for the sole purpose to make sure the Soviet Union was beaten, or at least so severely weakened that it wouldn't be a force in world politics at all. In the end, when the second front was opened in June 44, it wasn't to defeat the Nazis, because the Soviet Union was well on its way to being able to do it single-handedly. It was to forestall the liberation of Western Europe at the hands of the Red Army. That was its purpose. In the closing days of the war, a meeting took place, literally a month or 5 weeks before the end of the war, in the beautiful Baltic town of Lubeck. You must visit it if you get a time. And at that meeting, SS Chief Himmler was present, and came the representative of the so-called neutral country, Sweden, Bernadotte Falk, Count Bernadotte Falk. And Himmler signed an agreement of surrender to the American and the British forces, provided that they would march hand in hand with Germany and turn against the Soviet Union. That was their plan. But of course, Soviet victories came so swiftly that plan could not be carried out. And then after that, the race was as to who shall be reaching Berlin first. And that's where the armies meet. Hence, the division of Germany, eastern part, which later on became the GDR, and the western part, and Berlin in the middle of GDR, divided into 4 occupation zones. The French get the occupation zone because they were an imperialist power. They played no part in it. The only people who fought against fascism over there were the French people, led by the French resistance, led not by Colonel de Gaulle, but led by the Communist Party of France. In that fight, 70,000 partisan fighters, mainly belonging to the Communist Party, lost their lives. And we pay tribute to the French resistance at this meeting. I am not in the habit of meeting people from the French bourgeois circles. It just hasn't happened. I've got no objection to meeting them. It just never happened. But they're very cagey. They will talk about the First World War, but never about the Second World War, because their role was shameful. Before the war, they were egging Germany to fight against the Soviet Union. Then as soon as the war came, and they crumbled because half the bourgeoisie was against that war. They established the Vichy government, and most of the French bourgeoisie was on their side. That's precisely what happened. So that, comrades, in brief, is the real story. It's not a real story that you will find everywhere, because history is being rewritten and falsified in the interest of the bourgeoisie. But in the end, truth is a very powerful force. It will come, and we might be alone, But we will not be alone, and we must, even when we are alone, in the fashion of Galileo, we must keep on repeating the truth. Galileo was put in very difficult positions by His Holiness the Pope. On what? Because unlike other people, unlike what the Bible said that the sun revolves around the earth. And Galileo's mistake was, like his predecessor Copernicus, said, no, it's the other way around. Now, how can you say anything against what the church says? It reminds you of jihadi fundamentalism, doesn't it? You know, or what the Hindu fundamentalists do in India. You know, talk nonsense and expect everybody to believe that. Now, and in the end, when Galileo was in his deathbed, His Holiness the Pope sent a couple of cardinals to ask him, what did he think about this question of earth and sun? And his answer was, it still moves. Comrades, science fears no debate. It does not fear truth. And we shall continue to sing the praises of the Soviet Union, of the Red Army. And before I close this, and I'm really closing now, is everybody forgets in Western Europe the contribution made by people in the East. Our chairman has reminded us, George Galloway has reminded us. I used to think that the Chinese people lost 27 million people in the fight against fascism, both of the Japanese type and of the Chiang Kai-shek type. And I was talking to His Excellency, the counselor from the Chinese embassy. He said, actually, they lost 35 million people. How many people in Western Europe know that Chinese were involved in the fight against fascism? How many of them know that the Chinese people lost 35 million people? And it was through that complicated situation that the Chinese became victorious. Chairman Mao famously once said, the situation, there is chaos under heaven. The situation is wonderful. Out of bad things come good things. There's chaos in this world today. Imperialism is causing a chaos. But make no mistake, there are chinks of light. Out of this will come the victory of the peoples of all countries, including peoples of the imperialist countries. Just a couple of more sentences.